Welcome again, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this APF at-home fireside chat. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Robert Enright this evening, a recipient of the newly redesigned APF Gold Medal for Impact in Psychology. I'm Dr. Katherine Nordal, a member of the American Psychological Foundation Board of Trustees and your hostess for this evening. As all of you surely know, APF is the premier private grant-making foundation in psychology. APF provides over $1 million annually in grants awards, with increases coming every year thanks to the generosity of our donors. Our goal is to support psychologists and students whose research uses psychology to address major societal issues and improve people's lives. APF is unique in that it receives the overwhelming majority of its funding, around 95%, from individuals like those of you who are joining us this evening. We cannot express our gratefulness enough to you for your generous investment in APF and the important research that we continue to fund. As we proceed through the evening, if you have any questions for Dr. Enright, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will do our best to address all of your questions in the conclusion of this evening's program. It is now my immense pleasure to introduce our guest this evening for the first fireside chat of 2022, Dr. Robert Enright. Dr. Enright holds the Aristotelian Professorship in Forgiveness Science within the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a licensed psychologist and founder of the International Forgiveness Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disseminating knowledge about forgiveness and community renewal through forgiveness. Dr. Enright is the first to have published a scientific study on the topic of person-to-person forgiveness in 1989. He has been called the forgiveness trailblazer by Time magazine, and is often introduced as the father of forgiveness research because of his 37-year commitment to researching and implementing forgiveness programs. Dr. Enright is the editor of 7 books and over 150 publications centered on social development and the psychology of forgiveness. He is the first to publish research on forgiveness therapy in 1993, as he developed the 20-step process model of forgiving. His book, Forgiveness Therapy, won the International Expanded Reason Award. Welcome, Dr. Enright.
Thank you very much, Katherine, and the American Psychological Foundation. It's truly my honor to be with you.
Dr. Enright, as I read in your bio, you have been widely referred to as the forgiveness trailblazer and are widely recognized as the leading voice in forgiveness research. I think this is such a fascinating area to focus on in psychology. And I say that partly because in my 32 years of clinical practice, there were a lot of clients that I saw who had real forgiveness issues that underlied the psychological problems that they came to therapy about. So I'm curious about what led you into this area of research. Would you begin this evening by sharing a bit about how you became so passionate about this area of study?
Yes. Well, in 1978, the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Educational Psychology hired me in their human development area to primarily focus on moral development, which was a very big topic at that time in the 1970s. But the primary consensual idea was for all of us to think about how children, adolescents, and adults grow to think more complexly about justice or fairness. And that had a long history from Jean Piaget's The Moral Judgment of the Child in 1932 to Lawrence Kohlberg's work starting in the 1960s. And he was one of the top 100 psychologists of all time by the 1970s. So I was a very obedient academic, and I fell in line with that particular research. And I got tenure studying how people think about others who are maybe unjust to them and how they want to be just back to others and lead a life of fairness. I had a lot of publications, a lot of grants, and I woke up one day and asked myself what I call a very dangerous question. Who exactly are you helping, Enright, by this particular research you're doing? And I had to answer myself with a little bit of a gulp and a gasp. I don't think I'm helping that many people. I'm kind of helping those who are my colleagues, and we go to conferences once or twice a year, and we pat each other on the back and we say, way to go with your most recent publication. Then we go back to our own laboratories helping nobody. So at that point, it was 1985. As I say, I'd already gotten tenure. I threw all of my research over a cliff, I say. I've never gone back and read even one word of that which was very good to me in the first 7 or so years of my work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So here I am at a major publisher parish university without a new topic in moral development. What am I going to do? And so I started thinking, well, what in the area of morals could be really helpful to people? And I thought of the reverse of justice, which in other words would be this. What happens when you're thrown down into the pit of injustice by other people? How do you climb out of that pit? And the more I thought about it, the more the word forgiveness kept coming up. So I thought, well, you know, that very well might be an answer to this idea of being treated terribly unfairly by others. And since I'm in the helping professions, I'm sure there's work on this that I've simply missed. So I had to do something very primitive, Katherine, in 1985. I had to walk all the way to the library, and I couldn't do a Google search because it didn't exist. And I had the librarian help me with this big mainframe computer. And I said, please pull out for me every single published article that is empirically based on the topic of forgiveness. I figured, you know, there must be dozens of them. And she came back a half hour later, a little bit stoop-shouldered, and said, there isn't any. And I had a friend who was an industrial psychologist, not an academic, who was also becoming interested in forgiveness in the workplace. And he did the same search at the University of Kansas and came back with a blank sheet of paper. So here we are with an inter-rater agreement of 100% that there's nothing out there. And so I started what we called the Friday Forgiveness Seminar, which is still going on to this day. We are meeting in 2 days in our Friday Forgiveness Seminar with, of course, a new cast of characters, because those originally there have long since gone away to other things, to better ideas for them. And in that original Friday Forgiveness Seminar, we started asking 3 questions. What is forgiveness? How do you go about it? And what happens when you forgive? Psychologically, what happens when you forgive? And I'm a very slow learner. It's been 37 years and we're still asking those questions. And we're deepening our understanding of what it is, how you go about it, and what happens when you do. But it has seemed to enrich a lot of lives, including those who were able to pioneer this with me.
Great. So, Robert, when you use the word forgiveness, how exactly do you define or describe what forgiveness means?
Okay. You have to keep in mind, because I have what's called the Aristotelian professorship in forgiveness science, as you had said in the introduction, I take my learning from what I think is the most profound thinker on the planet ever when it comes to the moral virtues. That would be Aristotle from ancient Greece. And he instructed me that whenever you're trying to find out about anything, you have to come up with what he calls its essence, its bottom line, not the nuances that come out in different cultures or different conditions or different belief systems, but what it is at its core. And so we actually started this Aristotelian idea decades ago by examining ancient texts, whatever we could read in English. And that ended up being Hebrew, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Confucian, whatever we could get our hands on, whether it was faith-based or philosophical. And we think we have parsed down the essence of what forgiveness is, that any one of these ancient texts would not necessarily wholeheartedly agree with us entirely, but basically would say, yeah, that's the gist. And I think, and our group thinks, that forgiveness encompasses 3 points. First of all, you've been treated unjustly by others. That's the unique aspect of the moral virtue of forgiveness. It is centered on being treated unjustly by others. Second of all, you strive to get rid of resentment toward the other. You get rid of the negative, get rid of resentment toward the one who is unjust to you, and you try to be good to the other in some way, whether it's a smile, a returned phone call, something kind about the person to others. And we have come to realize it really is a moral virtue, because moral virtues deal with the insight and the motivation to be good to others. Justice is what? Motivation and understanding for a fair exchange. Patience is not being mean to those when you're getting annoyed. Forgiveness is goodness toward those who are not good to you. But at the same time, Aristotle warns us when we're trying to understand a phenomenon, be sure to define what it is not, so it's not confused with other constructs. And so we have come to realize that to forgive is not the same thing as to excuse. You don't say when you forgive, that's okay, no big deal. No, no, no. What happened to the person was unfair, is unfair, and will always be unfair. We've come to realize that the term forgive and forget isn't exactly accurate, because when it comes to trauma-based experiences from other people, we don't forget those. It's like if you have a sports injury and you have to go to sports medicine because you break your arm, you don't forget that. But what you do once you've healed from that is you remember in new ways. So when you forgive and you look back, so you remember so it doesn't happen again, you don't remember what that resentment built up anymore because that's gone. Also, forgiveness is not, and here's where forgiveness gets in trouble when people don't understand this, it's not the same thing as reconciliation. Reconciliation is more of a negotiation strategy between two or more people who come together again in mutual trust. When you forgive, that's unilateral. That is your free choice, your decision to exercise this moral virtue. And you may try to be good to the one who isn't good to you at a distance. You cannot come together again in mutual trust if the other keeps hitting you over the head with a frying pan. And another thing that it is not abandoning justice. Aristotle taught me that as well. He said, when you exercise any moral virtue, don't throw away the other moral virtues. Many people think of forgiveness and justice as either or. You either strive for fairness, and there's no mercy toward the other, or you're merciful and be good to the one who hurts you and forgive with no justice. And so you let the other keep hitting you over the head with a frying pan. No, no. Aristotle in his deep thinking says, let both forgiveness and justice grow up together so that you can forgive from the heart if someone has hurt you and watch your back. You can forgive and ask something of the other in fairness so that you possibly can reconcile, but that oftentimes is up to the other person as you extend your hand of peace.
So one of the things I said, I think in the introduction was, it seems to me in my many years of clinical experience, forgiveness or lack thereof is a big issue in psychotherapy for a lot of people. In one of your books, Forgiveness Therapy describes a process model of forgiving, some of which I think you just talked about. But could you briefly describe that process of forgiveness? And so what do people do as they forgive, and how can we as psychologists and some of our attendees at the seminar today that may be interested in this, how can they incorporate this process model of forgiving into the psychotherapy work that they're doing?
I think that's a really important question. So it's really two questions. Let's ask the question first. How do you go about introducing this into psychotherapy? Then I want to talk about the roadmap of forgiving, which was our second question when we started the Friday Forgiveness Seminar. How do you go about it? But when we take a look here at psychotherapy, we have to be careful not to impose. See, if you and I hear about forgiveness and we like it and we're mental health professionals, and I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Wisconsin, I do not impose that on people and say, oh, your spouse abandoned you. Have you ever thought about forgiving? Or you should forgive. No. That Carl Rogers, who used to be here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he wrote on Becoming a Person here. When he talked about being client-centered, I like that message, where he's saying you don't lead the client, you let the client have the inner world unfold. And so once you establish the therapeutic bond, and you and I know that that can take 3, 4, 5 sessions before trust builds up, camaraderie builds up. If the person is continually bringing up injustice after injustice after injustice, eventually using the word forgiveness as a what do you think, as a possibility, very gentle, could be put on the table. And it isn't as a demand, but as a possible suggestion. And what I actually find is that when people have tried everything under the sun to heal, and it's not working, the idea of forgiveness then sounds not so bad. But because people use the word forgiveness and they rarely understand it deeply, there is a tendency at first to think it's crazy. It's like ridiculous. You're saying to be good to the one who isn't good to me. And then you have to explain that as a paradox. It's not a contradiction. It seems to be a contradiction, but it's an apparent contradiction that actually has a good ending, that when you are good to the one who isn't good to you at a distance, if possible, without reconciling necessarily, you are the one who heals. That's when people say, I choose it for myself. So if they choose forgiveness for themselves and we don't push it on people, okay, no demands, we then go through, first of all, the roadmap of forgiveness, our process model, where I lay out where we're going. And that can literally take months and months. For example, when Suzanne Friedman and I worked with incest survivors, it took each one of them one-on-one for 1 hour a week. It took them over a year to finally say, I have forgiven father or father figure, okay? So we lay out the map first, because it's not going to be accomplished even in a few sessions. As you and I know, trauma takes time to heal. There's no quick fix here. So we go through what we call 4 phases of forgiveness in the process model. And we use the word phase deliberately, like the phases of the moon. Phases of moon go slowly, okay, through time. Phases unfold slowly. And we did that to create the expectation that when you are building up in this moral virtue of forgiveness, be sure to know that you will need perseverance and time. So we start with the first of 4 phases, which is called the uncovering phase. That's a hard one, because the uncovering phase basically looks at, and this is very important because a lot of people don't get this, we look at the effects of the injustice. We don't dwell on the injustice. That might have happened 20 years ago, where someone was abandoned by a spouse 20 years ago. We don't dwell on that. Instead, we look at what we call the effects of that have tumbled into the person's psychology. and literally remain there extremely stubbornly and don't go away. One of the effects we examine during the uncovering phase is level of anger. And a lot of times people come to us denying how much anger they have. If you ask in the early phases of therapy, especially when the therapeutic bond isn't strong, on a 1 to 10 scale, how angry are you? The person might give it a 5. And it's because they're almost afraid to admit the level of anger within themselves because they think there's no cure for that. And so we say, well, part of this is to uncover anger, and it's safe because we literally have a cure for that. Okay? Most psychotherapies don't have a cure for anger. We say there is a cure for this, so it's okay for you to be angry, and when you're treated that unjustly, it's understandable. So the defense mechanisms start lessening, the denial, the displacement, the suppression. And a person then can admit, oh, I have a lot more anger than I thought, and I've been carrying this with me for decades. And then we ask such questions as, well, if you've been angry like this, has this affected you in any way physically? And a lot of times there's sleep disturbances. The biggest complaint I see is fatigue. People are tired of being tired because, see, they're carrying around on their back the sack of anger that they've been really almost nurturing for a long, long time. Another effect is rumination on the person, thinking about the person. You might be driving down the highway and maybe someone is driving past you the way your spouse used to drive. That clicks in, that association, or you're watching a film or something like that. But rumination is can be a very serious effect of problems that happened decades ago. For example, I talked with one young man who was in college, and he was away from his father now, and his father used to beat him when he was a child. Okay, he's now 22 years old. He's been away from his father for a while and hasn't been beaten for over a decade. But every night he went to bed, he would have a dream of his father chasing him and bullets flying. Every night that he started dreaming, it was of his father chasing him. How restful is that? That's an effect, you see, okay? And it's rumination. Comparison of yourself with the other can also be very painful. Everyone thinks the one who hurt me is so great, and here I am dying inside, and that intensifies anger and depression. Okay? And then another thing we find is, and this is something people are kind of shocked to hear, clients, one's worldview, one's philosophy of life. It might be if someone has a faith base, how they're thinking about the relationship to the divine, all gets turned upside down, where the glass is half empty rather than half full. Nobody can be trusted. It's not unusual in forgiveness therapy to find people who've been so brutalized in an intimate relationship that this person cannot trust anybody. And it blocks that person from a new relationship, all because of what happened 10 years ago. How fair is that? So when you look at all of these effects, denial of anger, the fatigue, the comparison with the other, the rumination, and a wrecked worldview, all of that is terribly unwarranted, terribly unfair. And I wish the world didn't work this way, Katherine. I really wish it didn't, because the injustice early on is bad enough. But I think I have come to realize the effects are actually worse than the original injustice, because that is ended. We can't have someone build a time machine for us and go back in time and deal with that. But the effects come forward to the present time, and listen to all of those effects I have given you in 5 minutes. They tumble into the heart. They are very unwelcome guests, and it's very hard to get them to leave. And so in this uncovering phase, that's prior to doing the work of forgiveness, the person understands, I've got a lot more pain than I thought I have, And it's directly connected to what happened to me years ago. Early trauma is alive and well in the human heart now. So then we move to the decision phase. The decision phase basically is, do you want to try this approach we call forgiveness? It's totally up to you. If you don't want to do it, we have other approaches. This is just one, but it's one that's empirically verified. Do you want to give it a try? People sometimes need weeks to think about that. And if they say, I want to give it a try, we start with the definition. We say it's a moral virtue like justice, kindness, patience, love, and you're going to be trying to build up in this moral virtue by trying to be good to the one who wasn't good to you, by trying to deliberately get rid of resentment and offering some kind of goodness, even from a distance. You won't excuse, you won't forget, you remember in new ways, you may or may not reconcile, and you won't throw justice under the bus. Do you want to give it a shot? The vast majority of people, because they have tried everything under the sun, say yes. So at that point, therapeutically, we tend to give a homework assignment, which is try your best to, 3 little words, do no harm. Try to do no harm to the one who hurt you. We can harm someone even though they might be in Arizona and I am, as the client, in Madison, Wisconsin, by talking disparagingly about that person to the rest of the family, for example. Or I can snub the person, or just be nasty to the person if I work side by side, if it's a work-related issue. The point is, try to deliberately not do no harm and to throw the pain back to the other. That's the beginning of the therapeutic regimen. And so then, once the person understands forgiveness, what it is and is not, works a little bit on the do no harm, we enter the work phase. I sometimes calling it hitting the forgiveness gym and becoming forgivingly fit. I say, you're going to start doing some work now, okay? We're hitting the forgiveness gym. You ready for this? And a lot of times the person's a little round-shouldered because there hasn't been a lot of change yet, but the person is willing to go through that gymnasium door, and I let them know that that's courageous. That is very courageous because that's hard to do. And so then we enter several different processes within the work phase. And the first one is about thinking. It's thinking about the other person in new ways. And if you notice, forgiveness therapy is taking the light away from the client and turning the light toward the person who did the injustice. That's a big difference between forgiveness therapy and traditional therapies. We shine the light onto the one who did the hurting. And we do it, first of all, with thinking, because it's easier to think about the other than to feel good feelings. And we have 3 patterns of thinking. The first one is what we call the personal perspective. The second one is what we call the global perspective. And the third one is what we call the cosmic perspective. And the personal perspective is only effective if you know the person. And most of us, sadly, know the people who hurt us, because those who know us tend to hurt us the deepest. I wish the world didn't work that way, but that's the way it is. So most of us can engage in answering the following questions. What was life like for this person growing up as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old? Was that person tripped up in any way by anyone? Was this person wounded by others in any way? Confused, frustrated? Was that person's world beginning to turn upside down? How about as an adolescent? Are there any wounds this person carried into the relationship with you? How about as a young adult? And then we keep going depending on the age of the person. You see, what we're doing right there with the personal perspective is expanding our story about who the other is, not defining that person exclusively by the unjust events. Because a lot of times people come to therapy and they're fuming at person A, and the only thing they see with person A is all the bad. And so they have stereotyped this person as a really bad person. And the personal perspective doesn't get rid of that, at least not right away, but asks the person to see the confusion, the woundedness, the vulnerability, the fear in this person. And that can take weeks to develop a true story about this person that's broader than focusing only on the injustices. Then we go to the global perspective, where we talk about shared humanity. I say to clients, do you know that both of you share a built-in worth, an inherent worth? Oh, what do you mean? What do you mean by worth? You have value that cannot be taken away from you, and I'll prove it to you, regardless of your belief system. Let's do a materialist view, a biological view. Did you know that you have, unless you're an identical twin, unique DNA, that there's been no one ever like you on the planet, never will be? Huh, never thought about that, the client would say. Well, did you know that the one who hurt you has unique DNA? Never anyone like this person on the planet. You are both special. You are both unique, and you are both literally irreplaceable. Where when you are gone, and when the one who hurt you is gone, there'll never be anyone like you on the planet. You share being special, unique, and irreplaceable. You share humanity, not just with DNA. If you cut, you bleed. If that person cuts, the person bleeds. We need adequate nutrition. Both will die one day. You share a common personhood. Now let's put that together with the idea of woundedness. You also share woundedness. And so there's something about you where you're both special, unique, and irreplaceable. You have a worth that can't be taken from you, and you've both been wounded by others in the past. And then the cosmic perspective comes to us only if a person has a transcendent perspective, okay? Only if the person might have a religious base, otherwise we don't go here. But if a person does, let's say we're talking with a Jewish person, and we've gone through the personal and global perspective, and now it's time for the cosmic perspective. And we make sure we know what that belief system is so we don't impose one. And let's say we have this Jewish person, for example, I would say, well, what does it say in the very first book of your scripture that was written thousands of years ago, Genesis 1? And it says, we are all made in the image and likeness of God, right? Ooh. And it's repeated actually in that chapter. It says it twice, and Hebrew scripture rarely repeats. So, client, are you made in the image and likeness of God? Uh-huh. Is the one who hurt you made in the image and likeness of God? Oh, I wish I didn't hear that. The client might say, I'm not ready for that. And that takes time. It takes time to grow into that idea. And when you put all of that together, oh, we're both made in the image and likeness of God. We share biological uniqueness, and therefore we both have inherent worth, and we've both been wounded. Who is this person? It's a much broader view. And when the client starts telling this broader story, the next step in the work phase in our forgiveness gym is that the heart begins to actually soften a little tiny bit. So that resentment is chipped away a little bit, and in its place starts coming, slowly growing, a compassion for a wounded, vulnerable, misguided person. Compassion is suffering along with someone and all of that person's errors in this case. And now we have an expanded story with compassion. And so then once the person is only strong enough to see the other in a broader sense and to have some compassion with a softer heart, we ask the person to bear the pain or stand in the pain. That's not new to us. That's not new to forgiveness therapy. Hospice has been using that theme for a long time. Grieving people, they say, lean into the pain. A psychotherapist who didn't do research in Israel, Morton Kaufman, wrote a piece in 1984 where he would ask his clients to bear the pain for the one who hurt you so you don't throw it onto others. And so now the person's standing in the pain, another paradox. As you stand in the pain, you realize the pain doesn't crush you. And as you realize you're not crushed, you say, you know, I'm stronger than I thought I was. This is not going to defeat me. And then the compassion can develop a little bit more and the story can deepen. And only when the person is standing in that pain that psychotherapists have been using, like Morton Kaufman, Alan Bergen, and hospice, for a while, do we ask the person to now put into practice the moral virtue quality of forgiveness. Are you ready to give something good to the one who hurt you? If the person is deceased, you can forgive the deceased by donating some money to charity in the person's name, right? Or you can have a kind word about the person to family members, or return a phone call, return an email, right? Be civil to the one who's next to you in the workplace. And so that giving actually then increases the largeness of heart, the magnanimity, to use Aristotle's word, the compassion, the more contemporary word, and that's the beginning of the reducing of that anger that can bring a person down. And that has to be practiced over weeks and months, and then we hit the discovery phase. The discovery phase basically comes down to meaning and purpose, finding meaning in what you've suffered and a new purpose in life. You know, clients say to me, I'm much more attuned to the suffering of others now that I've been through my own suffering and looked it in the eye. So that if I am waiting in line at the drugstore, I'm not going to be surly with the checkout person, because that person might have been standing up for 5 hours with other people being surly. That person's heart is probably hurting. I worked with a gentleman in a jail context, a correctional institution. And he said to me, I'm not getting out of here anytime soon, but I have a new purpose in life, which is to help my cellmates cleanse their hearts of the resentment that happened to them. And so meaning and purpose start to develop very deeply. And once that happens, we see at the very end of the discovery phase, and here's where our science comes in, we see that the person is released from the emotional prison. The anger goes down from clinical to normal levels. Anxiety and depression go from clinical levels to non-clinical levels. And you know who people end up start liking? Themselves. Because when they deal with the injustice of life, they tend to believe the lie, and they tend to disparage themselves. They not just get the gift of healing by being good to the one who wasn't good to them, they get their life back. They get a whole person back. And hopefulness toward the future goes up. And you see a thriving that they hadn't experienced in decades.
Thank you. Let's switch now a little bit away from maybe the individual to some international work that you've done. You co-founded the International Forgiveness Institute in 1994. Yes. And that group has the lofty goal, I think, of working towards world peace through forgiveness education. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Institute was started and maybe some of the work that you've done there?
Yes, well, it actually started in a somewhat humorous way, believe it or not, where I had an interview with the Chicago Tribune newspaper in the mid-1980s about forgiveness, because they had seen that we were starting to develop research on forgiveness and they were interested in that. And what they did is they actually published my home phone number. And what happened was, over the coming weeks, we were getting so many phone calls about people wanting help on forgiveness that my wife said, what do you think about putting the phone out in the woods? And right there, we realized that there was a huge need for everyday people who read the Chicago Tribune to get knowledge about forgiveness. So it became a service arm of my research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It is a not-for-profit organization, the International Forgiveness Institute, and we really try to share with everyday people what forgiveness is, resources, and then a big one that we're doing is developing forgiveness curriculum guides for children. I'm a slow learner, Katherine, and it took me until about 2022 to figure this out. I thought, well, we've been doing a lot of work with adults, and they really do seem to be cured from trauma of injustice. Why don't we start earlier and help children learn about forgiveness. We don't give them forgiveness therapy, we give them forgiveness education. Why not get them to learn about forgiveness so that when the storms of life come at 22 or 32 or 82, they will know about this. They will know what it's like. And that is not unusual. I worked with a 35-year-old woman whose husband very quickly abandoned her, and she didn't expect it. And she said to me, I want to forgive him, but I don't know how. What if she had forgiveness education at age 6, at age 8, and at age 16? She still wouldn't have been ready for the injustice, but she would be ready for how to deal with the injustice. And so we have developed curriculum guides through stories, such as Horton Hears a Who, a person is a person no matter how small, that's inherent worth, that we use in first grade and we use it in fifth grade. And we do it mostly through stories. And we have built curricula from pre-kindergarten through senior year of high school. We have all of these on our International Forgiveness Institute website, which is internationalforgiveness.com. And we have had people in over 30 different cultures throughout the world asking for these curriculum guides. And of course, they enculturate them. We have hundreds of teachers, for example, because of Peli Galiti, who's working with me at the university here, but she's from Greece. And she enculturates our forgiveness education programs in Greece with Aesop's fables and Homer's Iliad. Okay, so she uses different stories, but the idea of how people forgive in doing no harm and seeing the inherent worth of others is embedded in these curricula. And we bring them deliberately to challenged areas of the world. For example, we've been in Northern Ireland for over 20 years. This past year, we did work in Taiwan and in the Jewish and Arabic communities of Galilee. Okay, and so we try to go into areas where the political issues are such that the local communities themselves can have the challenge of being angry within the community. And we do not get political, even a tiny bit, with these curriculum guides. It's about thinking about forgiveness through story and applying it. If someone pushes you down on the playground, what do you do about that? And because they're much too young to be thinking about land disputes between Palestinians and the Jewish group. And so it's really, what do you do when someone calls you a name in the lunchroom? But we're really kind of pumped for this. Why? The point of education is to prepare you for adulthood. We need to prepare children for the injustices that will befall them, sadly, oftentimes very seriously when they grow up.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of your hypotheses have been if we can reduce anger through forgiveness education when a person is young, then they can maybe develop a protective factor so they don't develop harmful anger as they go through life. So how does that focus? It is preventive, but are there any other ways in which that focus is different from approaches to anger management?
Oh, yes, this is very, very different than traditional ideas for anger management. For example, the Freudian idea, the psychoanalytic, would, and this is a good point, would ask you to make that which is unconscious conscious and to see, well, you know, you're displacing a lot of anger onto others. And that's brilliant. And my hat is off to the psychoanalytic groups on that. But what we find is if there's deep, deep, deep anger and you make the unconscious conscious, you're still holding in your hand a big ball of anger. How do you actually cleanse yourself of that? Another approach is relaxation. Lazarus has done that, and that's great because if you can be relaxed, you're no longer fuming or you're no longer anxious. But what happens when you have to get up and go to work and you're not so relaxed anymore? There's the big ball of anger again. We also have other ideas like acceptance and commitment therapy, which also I like, which is awareness of your anger and abiding with it. So you don't do something with it. So when you're abiding with it, you are not fearful of that anger. You are being aware of that anger, and therefore you are processing that anger. But how do you get rid of it? You see, and the big difference is when you work on seeing the story of who this other person is and work really hard on that and see the inherent worth in both. And paradoxically, when you start giving good things through your anger to the one who hurt you, the anger literally can go away. And so that to me is probably the major contribution of forgiveness therapy that I have been able to see, which is clearly expunging the anger. And let me just read you one more quick quote. This is from Aaron Beck, who, as we know, did cognitive behavior therapy, a giant in the field. But listen to what he says about forgiveness therapy relative to cognitive behavior therapy. And I'm taking it from the back of the first edition of forgiveness therapy called Helping Clients Forgive. Quote, anger and the wish to punish a family member or friend for past grievances often remain resistant to the most useful cognitive behavioral approaches. He's admitting that. That's humble, that's wonderful and courageous. In this volume, Enright and Fitzgibbons, my co-author, show how forgiveness can help to finalize past resentment and allow people to lay their past grievances to rest. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you, Aaron Beck. Okay, so that's just giving you some idea that you can manage the anger. That's why they call it anger management. But what about curing the anger? When you go after the resentment by shining the light onto the other person who did the unjust treatment, you as client can literally get rid of that anger.
Sounds like forgiveness education might be a vital tool that could be used these days in schools in some of the work that they're doing in their health and education classes.
100% I'm with you, Katherine, on that. Oh boy,
yeah.
If the point of education is to prepare you for adulthood.
Right. A little switch now. So your research currently is focused, as I understand, on 4 kind of primary projects. What are those areas and how might they impact the larger field of psychology?
Okay, yeah, there are a number of themes that are near and dear to the heart of our group. One is correctional institutions. I have tried 7 different times over the past 30 years to get funding to go into prisons and help those who are in prison to see the injustices that have happened to them and to have a chance to expunge the resentment that has happened to them so that they now get rid of the rage. I have never been funded for it, okay? Nobody wants to buy it. I think one reason is the thinking is, well, we first have to get these people who are in prison to shape up and realize all they've done, so they have to stop that kind of behavior. Forgiveness therapy would say, no, you first have to have a preliminary kind of mental health treatment where you acknowledge that deep injustice against them, give them a chance to get rid of the hatred, then they will be open to traditional rehabilitation. And it's a hard sell, but you know what? We're fighting the good fight and we're not giving up. I'm sticking with this because I think it is a necessary precondition to traditional rehab in correctional institutions. I'm not saying get rid of those. I'm saying forgiveness therapy first. Okay? Another one that's really near and dear to our heart, and again, it's because it deals with a marginalized population, just like those in prison. And sometimes we refer to them as the forgotten people because they refer to themselves as the forgotten people, are those without homes or the homeless. So often when I do international travel, we see people sitting against a brick wall with a little cup, and we talk to them, and their stories would make you cry because they've been displaced from home or they've been displaced from the workplace. And the treatment for them because I've looked into grants for this, and about 100% of the grants I see, unless I'm looking in the wrong place, and it's honorable, is to give them housing. Yes, but Millard Fuller, who started Habitat for Humanity, once said this to me, and I quote, "We build the houses, you build the hearts. Unless we build the hearts, they don't stay in the homes." Mm-hmm. And so we need, just like in prison situations, to rethink the situation and heal the hearts of the forgotten people first. And then they're going to be ready for the rehabilitation and what we can give them materially. The third one is forgiveness education, as you and I have just talked, and we're doing work. We're finishing up work in Northern Ireland and Israel and Taiwan, as we mentioned, and we're also planting in Greece and the Philippines. We've been rolling that out for about a year, and we're not going to quit. I'm greedy, Katherine. I want forgiveness education in as many classrooms and in many schools as I possibly can for the hearts of the children. Mm-hmm. And the fourth one is a large one. It is something that's never been tried in the history of the world, to my knowledge, which is to try a large-scale forgiveness intervention within communities that have been at war. Mm-hmm. And we are moving with Charles Baraka in Malawi in Africa, and Monty and Stephanie Thomas in South Africa, to identify subgroups that have been at war. And we want to bathe the communities in forgiveness in their homes, in their communities, in their workplaces, in their places of worship for at least a year. See, to develop the heart of forgiveness takes time, and only within their community first. We are not asking them to start out and say, let's have you forgive those who've killed your children. No, no, no. Let's look within your own community and look at how the anger and the displacement is chipping away at the happiness and destroying individuals, families, and communities within your own region. And work on that and become proficient. As Aristotle would say, through practice, you develop a love of this virtue. Then let's do it with the other group at the same time within their own community. And once they grow in this moral virtue, see if they're willing to point toward the other community, this idea of group forgiveness. And we have a measure of group forgiveness, and see what happens to the hearts in terms of anger, anxiety, depression, but more importantly for the peace movement, what happens in your motivation toward the other persons, toward the other community. I think it's time for this experiment. And if it has ever happened in the world, I've missed it. This is the missing piece to the peace puzzle. So thank you to those who are working with us, Charles Baraka, Stephanie and Monty Thomas, Malawi, and South Africa. We're with you.
Wow, that sounds very, very ambitious.
It is. It might be too ambitious, but you know what? We've got to give it a shot.
Yeah. I think maybe we've covered this a little bit, but this area of forgiveness and justice sort of, was part of what you were saying too about these forgiveness interventions. Because I think there is a real a hesitancy to be forgiving if something really horrible has happened and you don't see justice happening. How does an individual begin to forgive in these really horrendous kinds of situations when there has not been justice? And we can think about that we see it in the news just about every day. There's been a gunman through a neighborhood randomly shooting people. There's been this, that, and the other. How does an individual begin to forgive when there has not been justice?
Okay. Jacqueline Song and I have a paper in an APA journal, the Peace and Conflict Journal, where it's entitled Justice First. And we came up with that title because I have been asked into the Palestinian communities of the West Bank 14 times. I do not push myself in there. I have been asked to give talks in the Palestinian communities on 14 different occasions. For example, one superintendent of schools said to me, the kind of anger that has built up here is literally destroying individuals, families, and the local community. Could you please come in and talk about forgiveness? So I say, sure. As I start talking about forgiveness, every time people start getting upset with me because they think I am a shill for Israel, and they think I am there at the invitation of Israel, not their own people in the West Bank, in Palestine. And they think what I'm trying to do is politically get them to lie down and die. And for example, I was giving a talk to about 100 teachers, and one teacher in the back of the room walked up, pulled the microphone out of the translator's hand and started yelling at me to sit down and shut up. Well, that was about the 10th time that has happened to me, so I was inoculated. It wasn't a big deal. I was used to it. So I asked her, I said, I'll sit down, but could I ask you a multiple choice question first? Okay. I said, it's A or B. Which one will you choose? A, you will live for the rest of your life without your land. It's a land dispute, okay?
Right.
And still with A, you will be living with a hatred and a resentment that you could pass to your children, and they will be miserable and your children's children's children will be miserable. That's A. B, you will live without your land for the rest of your life, as an A. But now you will be free from the resentment that could bring you down, your children down, and your community down. Which do you choose? She chose B and let me continue. And I've been using that multiple choice test whenever I get into the hot water of political debates where people think I'm a shill for the other side, which I never am. I try not to be political with this stuff. And people are beginning to realize, as Aristotle taught us, that you don't hold out this fist of justice until you get your way, because in all likelihood, when you deal with entrenched land disputes like Northern Ireland, English Irish, or like in the Middle East, this isn't going to be solved very easily. So how do you get energy, focus, and a calmer inner world so you can learn to fight better the next day, you see? And in fact, without the hatred, the way you ask for justice, this is important for the peace movement, might be qualitatively different than if you go to the peace table in an enraged way where you want the pound of flesh, as Shylock would say in The Merchant of Venice in Shakespeare's play. And so if we can approach the other as a person, if we can approach the other group as persons, that's the job of forgiveness. We might end up getting to a point where we can at least compromise with one another and not be beating each other up for centuries. That did happen in Northern Ireland, okay? Mm-hmm. They have been on each other since the 1500s, okay? How much longer will that last? They're not blowing up buses in the central city now, which they were 20 years ago, but the hearts are still doubtful. Belfast, for example, is still one of the most segregated regions of the United Kingdom, okay? And how's it been going in the Middle East lately in terms of Palestine, Israel? It's tough. And so why don't we fold in justice and forgiveness and not say justice first, because you're not giving yourself a chance to heal. And that's the bottom line. And how do you heal? Justice heals from the effects of trauma.
Yeah. I have, excuse me, one other question I want to ask before we turn to our attendees to see if they have any questions. Introducing forgiveness into psychology has not apparently been without some critics. What are the criticisms that are leveled against forgiveness and against forgiveness as a psychotherapeutic process? And how do you respond to those?
Okay. I've never had more to forgive than when I started studying forgiveness. And a lot of times it was because of people's misunderstanding of what forgiveness does, what it is, and how effective it can be. But here are 4 kinds of criticisms that are typical. First, I am met with the idea of irrelevance. People say, I don't really have anything against forgiveness. It just doesn't fit in the mental health field. It doesn't fit in the social sciences. So why don't you be a good boy and pack that away and join us with what we know is popular, and we'll tell you what to think. And my answer to that is no, thank you. I think it's very relevant in the sense that what does it do? It can cure the effects of trauma. It's not irrelevant. Another one, and this is a big one that has been making the rounds, some people even use the term the dark side of forgiveness. And there are publications like that, the dark side of forgiveness. And what they say is when they do research, let's say with spouses, and ask, have you forgiven your spouse for this annoying thing? The sad part of that research is they never ask the participant what they mean by forgiveness. In all likelihood, they might mean condoning or excusing what the other did. So let's hear what they mean by that. But the research seems to suggest that as you forgive someone's annoying habits, the other person thinks it's perfectly okay to continue the habit, right? First of all, that probably is confusing forgiveness with condoning the behavior. And what is it missing, everybody? It's missing forgiveness and justice growing up side by side, where you can forgive and say, let's talk about you putting me down every day with these little snide remarks. It's hurting and it's not fair. Let's talk person to person. And so it's not the dark side of forgiveness. It's the dark side of giving in to the nonsense. And forgiveness is being falsely blamed, okay? Another one I get, and this is a serious one because it can actually block, let's say, grant getting or moving forward in some zones, some areas. People say this to me: when a person is hurt by the injustice of another, they are hurting. You are now asking too much of that person who is hurting because the person is already hurting and putting a lot of energy into this. Leave the person alone. Don't ask now this other hard thing of hitting the forgiveness gym, as you say, Enright. Why ask someone to go into the forgiveness gym when they have a wounded leg? And here's what I say to that. Yes, it is a hard road for forgiveness because it's building up character. It's walking a path with practice that's effortful. To stand in the pain is effortful. To expand your story is effortful, okay? But at the same time, to make it clear, let's use a physical analogy. Let's say someone breaks a leg while running, okay? That person's hurting. Would anyone ever then say to that person, oh, we're not going to ask any more of you now. Don't go to sports medicine and have it x-rayed, and oh, don't have surgery because that's going to be hard on you. For goodness sake, don't do rehab on it, on your leg, because that's asking too much of you. Oh, really? So if it's not asking too much for people who have a physical challenge to engage in surgery and rehab, why all of a sudden is it too much to do the surgery of the heart, that is forgiveness, and the rehab in the forgiveness gym, so that you take responsibility for what the other did to you? If we wait and say, oh, well, let's let the other work it out by apologizing, good luck with that. A lot of times people don't apologize. That's why forgiveness needs to be your work in your forgiveness gym unconditionally when you're ready for that. And another big one is people say, what forgiveness does is it re-traumatizes the one who is the patient or the client, because that person now goes back and dwells on that which hurts the heart, and that's not true. When I gave you the 4 phases of forgiveness, how much time did we spend on the actual event of injustice? Hardly at all. You identify it and then you talk about the effects, okay? Forgiveness doesn't dwell on the injustice. any more than the doctor does when you've broken your leg and say, oh, let's really focus on this where you fell and tripped over the curb. And what was that like? And how are you feeling? No, it's quickly, what were you doing? Okay. And you hit the ground. Okay. And if you hit your head, were you wearing a helmet? I get that when I fall off my bike. And so here, the idea is we're not being re-traumatized. We focus on that person. We focus on the injustice so we can move quickly to what? To the effects. And the effects are what are with us constantly, it seems. And for so many years, we literally can take it to our grave.
Thank you so much, Dr. Enright. These are just really fascinating insights. Before we do turn to the questions, though, is there anything we haven't covered that you would like to share with our attendees?
Yes, there's something very, very important. So I'm glad you brought it up. And it has nothing to do with me and nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with the American Psychological Foundation. I am so impressed with you because you deal with quality, not quantity. You don't deal with number of publications or how many citations a person has, or whether the person is in a journal that has a lot of people reading it, or how many green pieces of paper, we call them money, do you have in your grant bank? Quantity, quantity, quantity. Academia is steeped in quantity. And that's how people get promoted and the accolades and all the rest of it. But you have taken the road less traveled, where what you have done is saying, I want to focus on ideas even if no one is paying attention to them. I wonder how many people were paying attention to Einstein when he was starting his theory of relativity. People probably didn't even know what that was. And it wasn't in the mainstream. And he probably got rejected. And there probably weren't a lot of citations at first. But the ideas eventually were seen as qualitatively good. And your focus like that is so unique, so refreshing, so creative, so wonderful. I want everyone to hear my deep, eternal gratitude that you are doing that and not pushing us all onto the same lane, doing the same thing for the same rewards. Yawn, that's so boring. Thank you for not being boring, for being adventurous. I greatly admire you. 3 things. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, and thank you for being with us. And I will go back now to Bethany. Have we got some questions from the audience?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Katherine and Robert as well. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. So just a reminder, if you have a question for Robert, please go ahead and submit that either in the chat or in the Q&A. One question that did come up is if you're someone who wants to go through this process of forgiveness, but you're not currently in therapy, is this something that you can walk through on your own through this model? Or is it something that really needs to be led in the psychotherapeutic realm?
This is all going to depend on the depth of the hurt, the seriousness of the injustice, and whether a person is comfortable trying it on that person's own. So what I recommend actually is this. Let's say this person has been hurt by 5 different people. And I have something called the forgiveness landscape, not in my first book for the general public, which is Forgiveness as a Choice, but in my second one called The Forgiving Life. And in the forgiveness landscape, I ask the person to take a historical view of everyone who has ever hurt this person and rate on a 1 to 10 scale how hurt you are now about this person, even if that happened when you were in age 6. Then that's showing you how you've been hurt by everyone ever in your life. Then I ask the person to order the ratings of 1 to 10 from the least serious to the most serious. So you now actually have a profile, what I call a landscape, of all of your wounded heart activities with all of the people from all of your developmental periods, and I say this. Start with a person who's hurt you on this earlier level where it's not a 10 in terms of woundedness, but maybe a 2 or a 3. It's still wounding. You could pick up one of my self-help books, no problem with that. And for example, start with Forgiveness is a Choice, which is a treatment manual we use that walks you through step by step the 4 phases of the process model of forgiveness. You see, you don't need psychotherapeutic expertise to walk the pathway of forgiveness when the hurt is level 2 or 3 or 4. But what's important to start there is you're just starting to hit the forgiveness gym. You're just starting to become forgivingly fit. Don't start running the marathon with the one who's hurt you on a level 10. And you can do the 3s or 4s by yourself, right? Then move up this landscape to the next person. Maybe it's a 5, then a 6. And you see you get more proficient in your forgiveness pathway where you can go through it more quickly and more deeply. And once you start getting into the 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s of the pain, then you can ask yourself, because you're much wiser about what forgiveness is, should I now seek professional help? Some people are getting so practiced that they don't need it because they have built their forgiveness muscle by being in the forgiveness gym, and they can continue on their own. But if they get to the point where they say, you know, I need a little help here, it's not dishonorable because we all need help with something at some time in our lives. And having the sounding board of someone who has wisdom regarding this moral virtue of forgiveness might be very helpful when you deal with the deep wounds of the heart. Start with the lower levels of pain. Start with one of the self-help books. I have 3 of them. Forgiveness is a Choice, the first one. The Forgiving Life, number 2, both by APA. And then 8 Keys to Forgiveness by Norton. Any one of them could be helpful to you. And see what you think. Practice, practice, practice. That's Aristotle's idea. You learn through practice. And then once you develop maturity in this moral virtue, giving something good to those who aren't good to you, then you're ready to develop what he calls a love of that virtue. And once it becomes part of you, it's actually easier, you're more highly motivated. Maybe you can then handle the 7, 8, 9, 10 hurts on your own. If not, professional help is not dishonorable.
Thank you so much, Robert. We did just have a question come in from Dr. Terrence Keene, who's the APF president, and he asks, confession in Catholicism has a major component of forgiveness. How does this tradition interact with your model?
For those who are Catholic and come to me for help, we now are on the cosmic perspective, right? We go personal, global, cosmic perspective. And if the person has a person of faith in this particular way, I say the forgiving that you could do through the book, for example, Forgiveness is a Choice, and the seeking of forgiveness in the sacrament of confession in Catholicism are hand in glove. They work together side by side. They very much are complementary to one another, because if this is a person of serious faith, then that person is going to take seriously the idea, forgive us our trespasses, that's in the sacrament of confession, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And so it's complementary. What it's saying is, if you love God, if you love what the church has to offer, then the council in Jesus gave that prayer, it's called the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. You want that to be complementary. You want to forgive to show you're on the team, and then you go to confession and are forgiven for what you have done. And then the Catholics would say, I'm waxing theological here, you get grace from that to be able to forgive all the more deeply, you see. In fact, one of the Catholic philosophers, Thomas Aquinas, put charity, and forgiveness comes out of charity, where you develop a love of the other. he didn't call that just a regular human virtue. He called it one of the theological virtues, that you need the grace of God to forgive deeply. Okay, so going to confession, you get rid of your sins, you therefore get the grace to go forward. Now you can forgive actually more deeply. But what of the atheist who says, well, what about me? Are you cutting me out of this? Absolutely not. Because forgiveness as a moral virtue can be practiced by anybody who's willing to do it, who has the free will choice to do it and is motivated to do that, can walk this pathway that we call the process model of forgiveness. It's not exclusively for certain kind of people with certain beliefs, but when we talk about the theology, grace would come into that, and therefore you would want to engage in the sacrament of confession to get that grace to forgive better and more often.
Okay, I think that was our final question from the audience. Am I right, Bethany?
It is. I do have a couple here that came in individually as well. And I want to just follow up quickly, Robert, on what you were just saying. And I wonder, as we've seen in the past, decade or so, a lot of things coming out in various religions that have resulted in a lot of feelings of betrayal by the religions. How does that kind of further complicate this when, the idea of forgiveness is often tied to religion for someone who then feels betrayed by their religious institution? I wonder if you can speak a little bit about kind of the intricacies that brings to this.
Yep. Well, I get that rather frequently, so it is a very interesting question. And here I say to people, make a distinction between the imperfect people in that institution and the institution itself. Oftentimes people make what I would call the error, the philosophical error of overgeneralization. And they say, if person X hurts me in this context, let's call it sexual abuse, because that's one of the major controversies these days, then the whole institution is bad. And I say, let's take a look at the history of that institution, and again, broaden the story. Is it really the institution itself, or is it the people within that institution? And if the person is leaving that institution, we go back to the worldview. Are you going, where's your meaning and purpose now? Are you going to abandon those entirely? Or are you going to find a new meaning and purpose that are also helpful and help you thrive? And if so, what are these meaning and purposes that you have? And just be careful. I'm not saying the person don't do this. I'm saying just be sure to make a distinction between the persons, certain persons who are wildly imperfect in that institution when they engage in sexual abuse of a minor, for example, and the institution itself. It's the same thing in a corporate situation, where if the office mate is nasty, do you say, this whole corporation is corrupt, I'm out of here? Or do you realize it is a certain person in this corporation? So you can do it secularly with regard to a corporation, or you can do it in terms of a religious base. Let us separate unjust, imperfect person's actions and the institution itself and what it stands for. Because most of these institutions never would say abusing a minor is part of our rules. It's actually totally against those rules. And it might be helpful to see that.
Thank you, Robert. We did have another question come in from the audience here from Diana Prescott, who says, a client has been wounded at a level 10 and stuck in anger and hurt. However, the client made a great deal of progress after a tragedy struck the perpetrator. Would this be due to feeling some compassion for the perpetrator after this tragedy occurred?
Well, you know what? That's going to depend on the client. The person might now have some compassion because the one who was unjust is seen as a vulnerable person. And that can be very psychotherapeutic. But it also could mean, and that's why you have to be careful with this, that the person's motive really is karma, baby. This person finally got what this person deserves. Now we've kind of balanced the scales a little bit. What is the motivation of the client? That's very, very important to discern, to see whether it's a revenge motive. Of course, that's indirect revenge, but revenge nonetheless, or seeing the vulnerability and caring about that person as a person. We don't necessarily know until we probe that. And so you're going to go in one direction as opposed to another. The person might not be ready for forgiveness at all because what they were really looking for was revenge, or now their heart is starting to soften, and that can be a useful therapeutic transition. What is the heart like of that client? I would ask that first.
Thank you, Robert. And that does look like that finishes up our question. So I will hand it back over to Katherine.
Okay. So
Oh,
Dr.
I spoke too soon. Sorry.
Okay.
We have one more that we can fit in since we do have a couple minutes here, from Stuart Cooper, which is any suggestions for persons whose life is being adversely affected by a close other who will not engage in this forgiveness work for injuries done by other non-related people earlier in the latter's life.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand the question first. So the client is the one who has to forgive, but the other person is entrenched also in rejecting the idea of forgiveness, whether it's forgiving or seeking forgiveness because of all that has been dumped on the other person. Did I understand it correctly?
I believe that that is my understanding of the question as well.
Okay. That's a really important question because what it's getting at is the balance between the client's willingness to forgive and the one who did the injuries willingness to even think about the idea of forgiving or seeking forgiveness. A lot of times those are out of balance. For example, in working with the client is totally willing to forgive. And the other person says, what do you mean? I didn't do anything wrong. Stop it. And besides, this forgiveness stuff is a lot of baloney because the person has been so wounded by others. That person doesn't want to forgive those from the past or even seek forgiveness. Forgiveness has been snipped out of the person's life. There's now an imbalance between the client having walked the phases of forgiveness, the uncovering phase through the discovery phase, and is ready to possibly reconcile, and the other is not. You have to realize when you're trying to make your way back to the other, that the other might be in a far distant place on that person's forgiveness journey than you are with yours. And that's why you have to be patient with the other. You have to be kind of long-suffering with that person, and even maybe forgive the person for being so entrenched and stubborn about it, okay? But notice that just because you want to forgive, there's no magic formula where the other's going to all of a sudden line up and say, oh boy, I've been really hurt by others. Let me forgive them, and I'm really deeply sorry for what I've done. That would be the perfect synergy. It rarely works that way. You might be all the way near the end of the work phase, and this person is just beginning in terms of the phases of seeking forgiveness. You still can be patient. You can still talk with the person on occasion, but if you see the person is resisting with the, how dare you come to me with this forgiving idea? You're annoying me, stop it. Okay, let's respect where that person is as a person. Don't expect so much, but you can still be freed of the resentments in your heart, that big ball of anger, by forgiving even if the other is resistant. So your forgiving is not dependent on what the other says or does or where that person is on their own walk of seeking forgiveness. Your forgiveness, when you decide to do it, can be completely unconditional. You then can be freed from that big ball of anger yourself, even though the other is still chained to that ball of anger with the other, and you can wait in the hope that this person will get it. Not everybody does. This is an imperfect world. At the very least, what do you get? Healing. I'll take that because in an imperfect world, that's pretty good.
Okay, is that with the questions, Bethany?
Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to say thank you again, Dr. Enright, for this very engaging conversation and our introduction into this really unique area of psychology. And congratulations for sure on your well-deserved Gold Medal Award. We also want to thank the attendees for joining us this evening. We will be offering these fireside chats through February of 2023. Details on registering for these upcoming chats will be included in the follow-up on this evening when the recording of this chat will be available on our website. We also invite you to share the recording and information for future fireside chats with anyone you think might be interested in joining us. We at APF wish you and your loved ones safety and health as we continue into the final portion of this year. And again, thank you, Dr. Enright, and to all of you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Katherine, and thank you, APF. I think you're wonderful.